Well, we come to the sixth of the seven messages to the ekklesia in the Roman province of Asia. And in this case, we get to the ekklesia in the city of fraternal friendship, otherwise known as Philadelphia. The traditional way to refer to the city in the state of Pennsylvania as the city of brotherly love overstates the original Greek a little bit, but we'll get to that in a minute. So let's look back at our chart that shows the structure of the messages of the seven, and we see here that the sixth one, Philadelphia, is chiastically parallel to the second one, Smyrna. And so that's just simply the structure of the A, B, C, D, C, B, A arrangement of the seven messages. But you can also note here in the column under opponent, right at the center, that both of them feature, and only the two of them feature, the question of a, quote, synagogue of Satan, unquote, and the question of a relationship between Jesus followers and people who claim the tradition in the scripture, but are not necessarily Jesus followers, if that's what's going on. And it may be or may not be, as we'll see. Let's look at where we are in Philadelphia. It's not as important a place. Let's look at the map first. We can see it here between Sardis and Laodicea. You'll note, and we'll talk about this next time, there are actually two cities along the road between Philadelphia and Laodicea, and one of them, Hierapolis, literally meaning the holy city, was one with a presence of Jesus followers there. So we'll consider the possibilities of why John's messages don't include a reference to the ecclesia there. But for now, we're in Philadelphia, the most inland of the seven cities. Let's look at it on Google Maps for a minute. There's not as much to see, but we can at least see where it is in relation to Patmos. There you see Patmos down in the water, of course, and now it's the city of Alasahir in Turkey. And if we zoom in on it, you can see where it is here. But there's not as much archaeological remnant. Mostly what we're seeing is just a modern city. But you get the sense of where it is in this little valley, separate from these mountains, in contrast to where some of our other cities were along the way. And again, if we look back at the atlas, you can see that Philadelphia was more on the edge of mountains and hence growing a lot of wine grapes, and Sardis here along the river that we saw was filled with gold. So a few things about the city of Philadelphia at the time. So again, like Sardis, it's in the region of Lydia, a minor city in Lydia, surrounded by more important towns like Pergamum, or like Sardis, for example. Founded by the king of Pergamum, when that was a separate kingdom, Attalus, in the 2nd century BCE. So it's not as old as some of the places, and had an imperial foundation, so it was never separate from either a Greek or Roman imperial context. Its economy was dependent not on its local, but on its surrounding vineyards, and I already mentioned the location. But as the easternmost, it's at this border between Greek culture, and yet it had close relations with Rome. So it represents the combination of Greco-Roman culture in that place. Like Sardis, it was destroyed almost completely in the 17 CE earthquake, and it was also rebuilt with imperial patronage, and therefore it was renamed Neo-Caesarea in gratitude for the Emperor Tiberius's patronage. Then we have something in this message that we don't have for many of the other places, and that's roughly contemporaneous, maybe a generation later, letter from Ignatius of Antioch to the ecclesia in Philadelphia. Presumably it's the same church. We don't know that specifically, but there's no reference to more than one. And let's look at a few quotes from that letter so we can see how different his focus is on what John of Patmos' focus is here. So we see from the prologue forward, I've excerpted two themes. The question of being loyal only to the bishop and the presbyters, not to the community as a whole, but to the leaders, and the question of doctrine as what holds them together. Very different than what John claimed in chapter 1 was what held him connected to the rest of these people who are following Jesus in the Roman province of Asia, sharing in the pressure and the hupomene, the promise of resistance. But we don't see doctrine so much the issue there, we see practice. But here, much like the first letter and second letter to Timothy, that take Paul's radical message and try to tame it down a little bit, it's not that Ignatius is necessarily taking directly John's tradition, but is certainly focusing it on what emerged in the 2nd century as the focal point, which is the authority of ordained people as the basis for church unity. So let's just look at a few of these quotes, and we'll see how often in a short letter, that's really only a few pages, he emphasizes this theme. So we see right in the prologue, he's saluting the church that is, quote, eternal and abiding joy, more specifically, if they be at one with the bishop and the presbyters. And then we see in the second chapter, as children therefore of the light of the truth, shun division and wrong doctrines. Where the shepherd is, there follow ye as sheep. Shepherd being, of course, the bishop. Then in the very next chapter, for as many as are of God and of Jesus Christ, they are with the bishop. If any man followed one that makes a schism, which would say a split in the unity, he does not inherit the kingdom of God. If any man walketh in strange doctrine, he has no fellowship with the passion. And it goes on again, and it highlights here, as we'll see in the Revelation message, the issue of Jews. So we see, if anyone propound Judaism unto you, hear him not. For it is better to hear Christianity from a man who is circumcised than Judaism from one uncircumcised. A lot going on there. First of all, we're hearing the word Christianity as a thing. It's something that is never mentioned in Revelation. Certainly John of Patmos has no sense of a new religion, and that idea is already being developed here in Ignatius. Second of all, we're hearing something that seems reversed. We're hearing the idea of Christianity promoted by someone who is a Jew, and Judaism promoted by someone who's not, who's uncircumcised. And what that could mean, of course, is that somebody who's a Jesus follower, as a Christian, is like the people that Paul tried to fight off. It was trying to say that you need to be circumcised and otherwise follow all the laws and rules and practices of Judaism in order to become part of the body of Christ in the ekklesia. But it's interesting that we also hear the other side here, that somehow Judaism would be promoted from one who's not a Jew. And the idea there, as we saw in the parallel piece in chapter 2, was the question of people trying to hide behind the context of a synagogue from Roman oppression. The idea that if you claimed to be a Jew but weren't, you would have a status. Although the Romans didn't like the Jews, at least they approved of Jewish status, whereas the emerging Christian status as something new and novel was very suspect. So there's a real question of whether people might have been trying to hide behind Jewish identity so they wouldn't be exposed as a member of an association that was very suspect to Rome, namely the Jesus followers. And then it continues, I cried out when I was among you. I spoke with a loud voice, with God's own voice. Give ye heed to the bishop and the presbytery and the deacons. Do nothing without the bishop. Keep your flesh as a temple of God. Cherish union. Shun divisions. And finally, in chapter 8, now the Lord forgives all men when they repent, if repenting they return to the unity of God and to the counsel of the bishop. So I trust we get the idea there of what's going on by the next generation. And similarly, as you can see with this parallel quote from 1 Timothy, where we see the same issue of doctrine and the bishop being important to someone who's almost certainly not Paul. All non-fundamentalist scholars pretty much say that these letters, the so-called pastoral epistles, 1 and 2 Timothy and the letter to Titus, were written to try to contain Paul's radical message within the Roman Empire, so the ecclesia wouldn't be destroyed. And we don't know for sure what happened to the church in Philadelphia after this time period, but certainly Ignatius's perspective is the one that emerged and shaped Christianity over the following centuries as it moved away from radical practice to unity around doctrine and hierarchy. So let's begin to look at the message itself. So it starts like all the others, to the angel of the church, and with a quote, and I'll bring up the parallels again, with a quote from the beginning of the title of Jesus here, an unusual one. The New Revised Standard has the Holy One, the True One, but really it's one thing here, the Holy, the True One. And as Audi notes there in my notes below, the two terms are not used together elsewhere in early Jewish or early Christian literature as titles or attributes of God. So as you can see, I put places in Revelation where true, here ha'alethenos is used with faithful or with just, but not with holy, so it's an unusual pairing there. And then this image of the key of David, which is going to be important in this section here. We're going to see key again, and the question of an open door and a locked door. The question of the key of David is clearly a reference to Isaiah 22:22, as you can see here. And the context of that, and I won't get into all the details in Isaiah, is the time of King Hezekiah and the question of what they should do in the face of the Assyrians. And there, as you see, the key of David is put on his shoulder, which is a very odd image to put a key on somebody's shoulder, but there it is. So what's plainly at issue in the echo in the message to the church in Philadelphia here is the question of being a gatekeeper, of having the opportunity to decide who gets in and who doesn't go in. And we know in chapter 4, when the vision, John's vision actually starts, he is shown an open door that he goes through that allows him to see the entire vision. So that's what's going on here with the Key of David. And of course, the question of the Key of David is the monarchy that was keeping Judah and Jerusalem together in the face of Assyria, Hezekiah being basically a prisoner of war in the palace under the Assyrians until the Babylonians came along several generations later and destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. So, after that introduction, we hear, I know your works. And what we don't hear is a criticism of a subset. It's one of the rare messages where the entire community is seen as a whole, and the challenge is there's an outside group, this synagogue of Satan, rather than we saw with Jezebels or the Nicolaitans or others from within the community who are allegedly splitting them up or leading them away from what John understands the vision of the risen Christ is. Although a generation later, there certainly seems to be some kind of split in the community, and it's not clear exactly what it is. There's an emphasis on staying with doctrine, staying with the bishop, but there's not an emphasis on what the specific doctrines might be that are at issue there. There's some hint that it had to do with Eucharist or with resurrection, but that's all it is, a hint, so we just simply don't know. So he knows his works, and they're not named directly here, although we'll see in verse 10 something that's praised. But here, usually, the works are named as what they are, as you see in the third column there. For example, in Thyatira, we saw the works of love, faith, service, and hupomene, faithful resistance. But here, just, I know your works. And then it continues back to the door theme. So look, I have set before you an open door which no one is able to shut. And that completes the theme that we saw in the previous verse. Then it shifts about their powerlessness. I know that you have but little power. Greek dunamis here used a number of times because Revelation is about nothing if it's not about power. So they have little power in the sense that they're a small city without great influence, and that might well be the reason why there's not a struggle, because there's not a temptation in this city to use patronage and access to the elite status within the temples to gain things that followers of Jesus, according to John's vision, should not be gaining access to. So they have little power, and yet you've kept my word and not denied my name. The word for kept here, terio, as you can see, is used several times right here. It's been used a few times earlier, and it's translated differently every time, which is a little odd. Let's just look back and see how that works, so you can see how important it is to pay attention to translation. So in 1:3 here, it's as keep, and that's what we saw here. But in 2:26, it's continues to do, rather than specifically keep. In 3:3, it's obey rather than keep. And then here in our message to the church in Philadelphia, we have kept here and then kept again down here. So terio is often used for keeping the commandments, and so here is being used for keeping Jesus' word parallel to the commandments in the Hebrew Scriptures. And have not denied my name, and again parallel to the question in Smyrna there about not denying their name. And so here we come to who the opponents are. I will make those of the synagogue of Satan who say they are Jews and are not. And that's the challenge here. The word Judaios here, not Judaioi for individual Jews, but a slightly different form of it, is only in these two places in all of Revelation, referring to this group of people. And so, as I noted at the beginning here, to say you're Jews and are not might mean you never were, you're Jesus followers and you're trying to hide behind Jews, or perhaps from John's perspective, people who have the ancestry within Israel but don't follow Jesus or oppose the Jesus followers are not really Judaios, because the real Judaios are the ones within the ekklesia. So it could be read either direction there. And it says they're Jews or not, but are lying. And the word here, pseudomai, the root, or pseudante here, is only here in Revelation, but we'll see the contrast like in 14:5 here, no lie was found. So the question of being pure and virgins is a question of having no lie in the mouth, but these people are not described in sexual imagery, but are described as lying. And as a result, the risen Christ will make them come and bow down before your feet. And this is an allusion here to Isaiah 60:14, which you can see there on the screen, of the hope of reversal. And it's the kind of thing that lead many people to criticize Revelation for simply reversing the terms of imperial subservience, rather than rejecting imperial subservience and replacing it with egalitarian community. I think it's too soon to reach that judgment here in chapter 3. We're going to have to stay all the way through to the very end when we see see the structure and the arrangement of New Jerusalem before we can really decide that. But this image certainly suggests that, and it's consistent with other images in 3rd Isaiah, like the famous one about the nations coming and offering frankincense that, of course, is taken up in Matthew's story of the Magi bringing frankincense, gold, and myrrh to the infant Jesus. And so once they bow down, which is they worship before your feet, notice not before Jesus' feet or before God's feet, but worship before your feet, they will learn that I have loved you. It's a rare use of the root agapeo, the verb here, agape se, in the aorist here, that I have loved you. Only those two places you can see in 1:5 and 12:11 elsewhere. And it's an odd combination of, by bowing down before you, they will learn that the risen Christ has loved this church. But there it is. And the reason for that is because you have kept my word of hupomene, or as the New RSV has it, of patient endurance. It's an unusual phrase, my word of hupomene. Previously, hupomene, as you can see here, was used in several times. Let's go back and look again. In addition to 1:9, when it was what John shared with the people he's writing to, we saw in the messages here to Ephesus, I know your works, your toil, and your hupomene. And then we saw here in 2:19, speaking, as you can see here, to the church in Thyatira, I know your hupomene. But here in 3:10, it's simply, you've kept my word of hupomene and resisted. So a little different formation of it there. So because of that, the risen Christ will keep you. And we're scrolling back up so you can see the connection. So the issue here, back to verse 8, is that you who have kept my word and not denied my name, and because you've kept my word, I will keep you from the hour of trial, coming on the whole earth to test the inhabitants of the whole world, to test the inhabitants of the earth. Let's look a little bit at that more closely. We saw the use of terio several times. The word for hour here is a bunch of times. Here's the first one. But this is the first time we see an hour of trial, and it's a test not for the ekklesia, but for everybody else, and we'll get to the inhabitants of the earth in just a moment. The word for trial, both in the noun form here and the verb form here, are used. Perizo is the verb, and perismo is the noun, and perizo is the verb. As the test or trial that is coming on the whole world here, not cosmos as in John's Gospel, but ekoimenes as in ecumenical, the whole Roman world, separate from the test the inhabitants of the earth. So the trial, which is not specified what it is coming on all the Roman occupied world to test the inhabitants of the earth. Kaidoi kuntes epiteges, as Richard says, they're a technical term for the wicked, those who follow the beast throughout. And you see a number of times, and starting in chapter 6, we'll see it a number of times as the 7 trumpets and plagues come upon the earth, as the inhabitants of the earth respond or don't respond positively to the heavenly engagement with them. So this test will come, and perhaps he's referring simply to what's described later in the book, but it's not clear. So finally, he says, I am coming soon, a phrase that we're going to hear a number of times. Taku, we heard it before, and it will be described at the very end in chapter 21 as well. Hold fast, which we've also seen a couple of times. You can see there in chapter 2, verse 1, 13, 14, 15, and 25 already, this sense of holding with strength or with power what you have. So holding on for dear life to the way of Jesus in the face of the temptation to give in to the way of Rome or the synagogue of Satan, so that no one may seize your crown. And it's ironic here to say, to seize your crown, and then say, if you conquer, because the crown here, the Stephanos, which would only certainly be a laurel wreath, is an expression of victory. So it's suggesting almost in reverse order that you've got a crown, but then says, if you conquer. So scholars have struggled over how to make sense of that, and I think when we try to overthink the linearity of these things, we get in trouble. The main issue is there's a sense of you've won a prize, the kind of prize Rome would give you for winning a race or some other athletic competition, but here it's for holding firm to the practice of hupomene in the face of the challenge of the empire. But again, the conditional still comes. If you conquer, I will make you a pillar in the temple of my God. And Robert Royalty has written a wonderful article that explores some of this question of the pillar here and what it meant to be written or inscribed on a pillar. And so you can see here an image of an inscribed pillar, which were common throughout the Roman Empire. Inscriptions were on many pieces of stone, whether those are pillars, columns, or stelae, freestanding stones that had expressions of things. But here here as a pillar in the temple of my God is expressing a sense of identity with the gods, who would be the people who are worshipped and celebrated in that temple, or the patrons who support the temple being built. And of course, in the New Jerusalem, in Revelation 21 and 22, there is no temple. So the temple of my God, in this sense, is the community. So in other words, it's being expressed figuratively, as we would expect, not literally. And the fact that you will never go out of it highlights that it's not a physical building, but the realm of God, the New Jerusalem, as we'll see. And so if you do that, the risen Christ will write on you, and this is the sense, as Royalty says, often translated grapho as write, but it literally means to scratch or inscribe on stone as well as to write. And so he sees this as the issue of inscribing your name, and the name of my city, the New Jerusalem, and my own new name. So the threefold writing of the name here is expressing a parallel to what they would do in a city context, inscribing the name of local gods and local donors. So in this case, rather than say Zeus or Jupiter or Athena or the local gods and goddesses in Philadelphia, it's the name of their God, the name of the city of my God, which is named here as New Jerusalem, and my own new name, the risen Christ. So all those things showing a contrary power to what the temples in Roman cities would do, claiming the power of the empire to bring peace, rather than the power of God's Messiah to bring peace. And of course it ends as always, let anyone who has an ear to listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. So that's the 6th of our 7 messages, and we'll come to the last one, Laodicea, which is parallel to Ephesus, 2 of the great cities in the Roman province of Asia, and we'll come to the conclusion of this section, and then we'll launch into the actual vision. So stay tuned as we complete the series of messages of the Ekklesia. See you next time. Bye-bye.